very pleased to be here with you, Wonderred, to make an interview, to try to understand more on this movement of family therapy in the past, in the present, and of course in the future.
Yes, and I'm very pleased to be here with you, Sylvia.
Thank you. So you have been the former director of Mental Research Institute in Palo Alto, which is a very famous and important place in the field of family therapy. Could you tell us about the history of this field? You know, you've known the most famous people in this field. You have worked on just this topic for years and years. Could you tell us more on the beginning of this movement in the 1950s and 1960s?
I will be pleased to try. John Weekland used to say when he would begin teaching at MRI that MRI began before it began, and what he meant by that was that MRI was born out of Gregory Bateson's research projects. The research projects began in 1952. Gregory Bateson was a cultural anthropologist. World War II had just ended. He was in the New York area, involved with other scientists looking at across disciplines, looking at cybernetics and communication, mathematics, at what was called the Macy conferences, a series of meetings over about a 10-year period that began in the 40s and into the early 50s. Of all of the really preeminent thinkers of that time, and Bateson was a member of that group, and so was Margaret Mead, by then it was his ex-wife, but they had been married for a period of time. And so Bateson was teaching at Columbia University at the New School of Social Science, and so was Margaret Mead. John Weekland, who had been a chemical engineer actually, decided to change the direction of his career. Had been doing some reading, had read Gregory Bateson, and it's an interesting story. He called Bateson up on the phone just because he wanted to meet him, and Bateson answered the phone, and John introduced himself as a chemical engineer, and Gregory, the story said, "Come over to my house right now." And it was John later found out that Bateson was involved in the Macy conferences. It's around 1946, and he assumed that because John was a chemical engineer, that he would be good at mathematics, and he would help him understand some of the mathematical equations that Norbert Wiener and Warren McCulloch and some of the other the scientists from Bell Laboratories were using. John said it turned out that that wasn't exactly true, but it did open a door for him, and they became friends. So that when Bateson got the first grant to study communication processes, the paradoxes in communication processes, he called John and his wife Anna Wu, and said, "I got the grant, let's go celebrate." And he invited John to join him. So John left his studies at the New School of Social Science and followed Gregory to California, to San Francisco, where Bateson began his research.
What is fascinating for us is that they come from very different fields, and they decided to work together, and all the movement was like that, people coming from different fields and deciding to exchange, to work together to build a new field, you know. And it's very fascinating because we understand that if they have stayed each in his field, nothing...
The people not talking to one another. I think that's true. I think at the time it was a very much very open within that group anyway. The conference is happening at MIT, Massachusetts Institute of Technology, and the areas, the intellectual sites around New York at that time were very alive and were very much open, interdisciplinary. And so out of that, when Bateson went to California to do this research, that continued, this openness to talking to other people and bringing the new blood or the new ideas from various disciplines together. And so that's how it began. And when they got to California, Bateson was continuing to work with a psychiatrist named Jürgen Rusch on communication at a place called Langley, the Porter Langley Institute. It's either the Langley Porter or the Porter Langley Institute in San Francisco. It was a hospital. And while there, they were looking for, Bateson was looking for a place to house his research project, and found the VA hospital in Menlo Park, California, which is about 15 miles up the peninsula from San Francisco. And Stanford had a relationship, Stanford University had a relationship there, and so he worked out of the anthropology department at Stanford, and their offices were at the Menlo Park VA hospital. And at that time, Jay Haley happened to be pursuing a master's degree in communication at Stanford, and had heard about Bateson and sat in on some of his classes and asked if he could join the group, and he did. So he was the third person to join the research group. There was a man named Weldon Keyes that joined, and another psychiatrist, William Fry, were the core group in about October of 1952. The research projects were actually 4 different grants that were consecutive, and the money was given from the Rockefeller Foundation to study. It was pretty open-ended. They were just given. Bateson was trusted with the head of the Rockefeller Foundation and the Macy conferences to do research on what he thought important. So they started looking at the nature of communication in a wide range of situations.
You know, for you French people as we are, to have this freedom to research what you want. In France, it is complicated to have such freedom to search, and because it's more
restricted,
shaped, more restricted, and it is for me this freedom. These several fields together. It's the beginning.
Absolutely. And John would comment on that regularly, and so did Jay Haley, where they would say when asked that routinely they would ask Gregory, "What is this research about?" And he'd say, "We'll go find out." And so they were going to the San Francisco Zoo and watching animals at play, and they were talking to a man who was he was a proctologist whose hobby was ventriloquism, which is interesting in and of itself. And so they would interview this man and watch him do his ventriloquist act. They were studying communication in the widest range of places.
Yes, they were interested in everything.
And everything.
It was a period maybe after the Second World War.
That's right.
Everything was open, and people who is curious and open-minded, it's incredible. But
very much, and now that didn't go on forever. Eventually, they started. The funding agents became more defined as to what they would fund, but it did continue for a while. For a period of time, they had a project where they made films of mothers of schizophrenics bathing their children. That was the project. They would bring cameras in, and they would film mothers interacting with their infant children. They had they had another project where they studied the eminent therapists of the day who were effective, who, when they would talk to people, people would get better. That in and of itself was a research project. They had another project where Jay Haley headed up this. They were trying to discover tests, ways to set up an interaction amongst a family that could be viewed so that you could see how their decision making takes place. Fascinating series of different researches that Jay Haley and John Weekland, but principally Jay. That was his part that he worked on. William Fry, who was a psychiatrist, was looking at the structure of humor, and so there was a number of research projects looking at the structure of humor, and he wrote several classic books in this. And so it was a very wide range, and each member was allowed to, in essence, study what they thought important. And at one point in that interaction, since they were housed at the Menlo Park VA hospital, John Weekland says that Jay Haley said, well, we have all of these patients here at the hospital, schizophrenics, alcoholics, why don't we study that? And so they shifted to looking at the nature of the interaction between therapists and hospitalized people, between the different hospitalized people themselves, and then the family's members as they would come visit, and that led to family therapy. In January of '54, and so they started formally in October of '52 as a group, and before that, Gregory Bateson and Jürgen Rusch had published their book, Communication, Communication, the Matrix of Psychiatry, by Rusch and Bateson, came out in '51. It's a brilliant book on the nature of interaction as a basis for understanding human behavior. So then in '54, as the story goes, told by Bateson from one perspective and Jackson from a different perspective, Don Jackson was a psychiatrist, had come back to California, back to the Bay Area. He had been in the Army, and he had been stationed in Washington, D.C., studying under Harry Stack Sullivan, another very famous and very important psychiatrist in the Washington, D.C. area at Chestnut Lodge in Maryland. And so Jackson, for about 4 years right after the war, had been there being taught by, without doubt, the most eminent psychiatrists, with an S, alive. And when he came back home, which was about mid-1951, home, he was from the Bay Area, his mother and father lived in Oakland, and he decided he didn't want to be that close, so he got a job across the bay in Stanford, and that's how he ended up working at the VA hospital, and he was given a lecture on family homeostasis, and Bateson was in the audience, and after the lecture came up and said, I think we have some things in common, and that led to Jackson joining the Bateson team in January of '54, and then they began to work together from that point. And it got interesting. Well, it was already interesting, but I had mentioned earlier, I think before we had actually begun our interview, that Jackson said several times in the literature that he thought the most important idea that they had found was the idea of redundancy, that things repeat and that you can observe them, patterns. And Bateson's thought on that was the idea that we communicate about our communication. Bateson had observed while watching otters play at the San Francisco Zoo that while two otters were playing, they would nip each other on the ear lobe, and once one bit too hard, and the otters went from play to combat. And it dawned on Bateson, my God, that's a communication about a communication. And that opened the whole new domain.
Yes, the question was, if I remember well, the question was, how can those animals know that it is a game and not a fight? So it's aggressive, but it is to play or it is to fight.
That's right.
And it was a new level of communication.
Absolutely.
They have a way of communicating.
About their communication.
About the communication. I wrote this article.
Yes. Well, that's brilliant, because that led to the whole idea that we are always defining the nature of our relationships. And it opened up communication. It opened up understanding what was happening by looking at the present moment exchanges between entities around the idea of defining the nature of the relationship, and it ushered in an alternative view of behavior. That is the view that continues.
The main concepts of the first period were settled at that moment.
Absolutely.
Homeostasis, you told us about pattern, communication and meta-communication.
Punctuation,
Yes.
analogic digital behavior, report and command. You know, all those ideas emerged out of the Bateson projects and then got verified over time.
And you know, I told you previously, what is interesting, when you make trainings with students, it's very interesting to see our students begin to see what happens in the family, for instance, or in a group, with different eyes. And when I wrote articles in that period, they saw something that which was here, everybody could see it, but we don't add the...
But we don't see it.
We don't see what was to
That's
be
right.
seen. And we don't have the theoretical frames to understand.
That's right.
And they bring us this very new way of seeing interaction between animals and human beings.
That's right.
Everything has changed after that.
Well, that's all right. And even, you remind me, you use the word frame. John Weekland talking about, there was periods of time when they would come up with a word, and they would dwell on it, and think about it and study it, work it through. Frame was one. What they were trying to make sense of context. So they talked about a frame around a picture, for example, how it frames whatever it is you think you're looking at as the reality. And so they spent an enormous amount of time talking about context, frames of reference. They got involved with they were talking to everyone. Everyone who had ideas, they were engaged with. And so Irving Goffman, for instance, in frame analysis, a very well-known cult interactionist-oriented sociologist, was influential, was involved with the team. It was those 5 primary people. They'd meet twice for a long time. They met twice a week, and then they met once a week. It was Tuesday, Thursday, and then they went to every Wednesday. And they would sit down with a recorder going, 2 recorders, so they'd have a backup tape, and then they would just talk about whatever projects were they were doing. Don Jackson, because he had the clinical background, was supervising the clinical work being done with the patients and their families. And so some of the very earliest family therapy was done by these people at the VA hospital. And that's a place where some of the differences began to emerge. I wish I had the direct quote in front of me, because it's a magnificent quote, again of John Weekland, where he said that there was only 5 of us. It's a pretty small group, and we were very diverse in terms of our backgrounds and our philosophies and ways of going about things. but that we had a unity in that we were interested in the nature of interaction in the current moment. And he said that it was this interplay of diversity and similarity amongst the five of them, out of which emerged communication theory. What I like about that is that it's very consistent with the theory. It's not an individual, it's not some great person, Bateson or Jackson or whoever. It's the emergence of the ideas out of the interaction of the group. And John was...
So it explains the birth of the movement. Explains,
absolutely.
Why it's till now open-minded, and it's not a sect, or you don't have to follow a theory which is completely shaped and blocked, and every student, every people who uses family therapy, my mind can be open-minded, can be
That's right. When we are at our best, we are that, and when we are at our worst, we are not.
And so
because we're human beings.
The history of the movement is quite different, for instance, from psychoanalysis, with Sigmund Freud was
the ruler.
The kind of rule, and you have to decide if you are in or
That's right.
Out. In our field, what is great for me is that we have a kind of freedom to create and to develop our own creativity. And it's due to the founders of the field.
I think so.
Because they work like that. They have this way of working, thinking, and if we want to be faithful to them, we need to follow this way of creating and interacting together.
Being open to this is just one way of thinking. There are many ways of looking at things. Yes, very much.
So this period, 10 years, let's say, between
1952
and 1962 was this period you described with these important people who worked together. We were very creative, invented a lot of things. And after, it was another period, or what happened? Well,
there was a total of 4 research projects. The 4th research project began in 1958. Bateson was the director, Weekland was the co-director, Jackson was the clinical director. And they got a grant from the United States federal government to use family therapy, conjoint family therapy, as the primary intervention with hospitalized schizophrenics at the VA hospital. And so they had a 4-year project where they were just seeing families at the hospital. Okay. And during that project, they brought additional therapists in to augment the team. And that's when Virginia Satir moved there, Jules Riskin, a psychiatrist at VA, at the MRI, came, Paul Václavic, Richard Fish, Irving Yalom, a whole Antonio Ferreira. These are people that their names may not be well known now, but at the time, these were very well-respected psychiatrists. Most of them were psychiatrists. And they came in and were working in the last Bateson project. And during that time, 1958, Jackson decided that he wanted to create an institute in the Palo Alto area to continue the project, to continue the work. And so he was working with, he was already a member of a group called the Palo Alto Medical Research Foundation, which is a research foundation that exists today in Palo Alto. And it's just as it sounds. They're a medical research foundation. They do research across areas of the medical field. And Jackson was the head of psychiatry at the hospital at the time. And he petitioned or wrote a proposal to found a behavioral pathology institute. It was the original name, behavioral pathology. So by the time it was made the Mental Research Institute, which was in October of 1958, the name had metamorphosized to the Mental Research Institute. And that's how it started. And Virginia Satir was hired to be the director of the first family therapy training program in the world, as far as I'm aware. She was teaching in Chicago in 1955. She was teaching at the medical school in Chicago family dynamics to residents. But an actual funded family therapy program didn't exist anywhere when they did that. So it depends on who you ask. There's competition as to who was first. Nathan Ackerman, it can legitimately be said in New York City that Nathan Ackerman was working at a hospital in Jewish family services, and they had a clinic that started about the same time. And then his Family Institut, which is what the Ackerman Institute was called before he died. When he died, the Family Institute was renamed. He died in 1970. They renamed that institute the Ackerman Institute. So there were pockets of people. There was a man named McDonald, a psychiatrist, in Galveston, Texas. There was a guy named, there were two or three around, different places. And what they would do, these psychiatrists were doing forbidden things because you weren't allowed to see the families of your client, of your patient.
When I began to practice psychiatry in France, you are not if you are a therapist of people, you are not supposed to meet the parents, or
that's right.
The parents had to be met. It was another psychiatrist or psychologist who can do that, but it was completely
forbidden. Don't Kansas.
Was it that moment where people consider that the family was responsible of the disease?
The disease.
So there was bad people, and we were to take them
That's right.
from the treatment.
That's right. But in the early 50s, this began to shift, and there was few people around, not only in the United States. There was a fellow whose name I can't remember, that was in Athens, Greece, that had started doing some work, and I think predominantly these were psychiatrists in the United States doing this. But they would get together at conferences, the orthopsychiatry, in the bar after the meetings, and in secret talk to each other about, I'm seeing a family. And it's out of that grew the... Yeah, it was scandalous, that's right.
So, this field was created, as you told us, in the 50s and 60s.
That's right.
So, after that, would you say that there is a second period of family therapy? We have heard about first cybernetic, second cybernetic. Do you consider that it is an evolution, that it is a real gap between this first period and what happens after? How do you consider that?
That's a good question. Just historically, let me just say out some things that I think I'm correct about. The mid 1960s was very important. Salvador Minuchin, who is a psychiatrist from Argentina, had come to New York in the late 50s, was under the supervision of Nathan Ackerman. So he had entered the field, but he was very young. He hadn't written anything yet. He started working at a place called the Wiltwyck School in New York, working in the slums of New York, working with very poor kids, basically. Okay. And he started writing in the early 1960s, is when 63, 64. So there's that coming into the field. Jay Haley had been with John Weekland and Don Jackson and Bill Fry, and even Gregory Bateson as a consultant, had moved over into the MRI as the Bateson projects came to a close in 1961. And they're working. But at that time, MRI and the Ackerman Institute in New York together co-sponsored and created the first journal of the field, Family Process. So that starts in 61. Jackson, everyone's doing their work, their research. Jackson's becoming really famous in his work with schizophrenics, I should say. and succeeding without either using medication or not making medication the primary intervention. So he's developing conjoint family therapy. Virginia Satir writes her first book, Conjoint Family Therapy, which is the training manual for the MRI's family therapy training. And so it's all bubbling. Things are happening.
It goes on.
Yes, Manute Bowen's over in Kansas, and then he moved to NIMH in Washington. Lyman Wynn comes in, Ivan Bajor-Maninaj in Philadelphia, all working under John Rosen, and then John Rosen, very famous, very important psychiatrist in the 50s, gets in trouble because of how he was handling some of his patients, and he becomes taboo. But all the people who were working with him become, Ivan Bajor-Maninaj and Sheffield, some truly brilliant, observant communication analysts. Ray Birdwhistle was part of that group. So there's things happening in Philadelphia, and they're all getting together at these early meetings, and it's coming up. And then I think some significant things happened. Jay Haley decided to move from California to join Mnuchin and Braulio Montalvo at Philadelphia Child Guidance Clinic, mainly, according to Jay, because he was tired of living from one grant to the next. The grant would end, he'd be poor, he wouldn't, he's married, he had a family. And so Salvador Mnuchin offered him steady work, and he went. So when he left, this was just before Don Jackson dies. Don Jackson dies in January of 1968. In 66, the late 66, Virginia Satir had become so much in demand that she's flying all over the world teaching, and so she had left MRI. So there's a lot of things happening at MRI that are changing things. In 1966, about that time, Dick Fish and John Weekland and Paul Václavic and Don Jackson and Jay Haley, in fact, because Jay was still there, start talking about creating a brief therapy center, intentionally looking at how to make therapy more effective and efficient. So Jackson got the money, which he was always the guy that got the money, together to start the MRI Brief Therapy Center. Dick Fish was the director. So the BTC begins and starts seeing its first clients in 67. So there's just a lot happening. Jay Haley's already created strategic therapy with the book Strategies of Psychotherapy.
What is,
we're not yet to the first and second order cybernetic.
Yes. What is interesting for me is that they don't fight, They have not exactly the same conception, and they develop their own model, but they don't lose a lot of time as in other schools of psychotherapy. So Mnuchin can be friends with Jay Haley, and we work with Virginia Satir and with
That's right.
Don Jackson and so on. And everyone can develop his own model, but they don't lose those things.
They don't lose prestige because they're not exactly the same. And I completely agree. This is a very important part of the early years. They were interested in each other's ideas. It was better if you were different, so you could contrast and compare how you're going about things. I'm not sure when that change happened. Jay Haley said that he didn't know how important Don Jackson was until after he had died. That Jackson had such a relationship with so many people in the field that those differences that could really get arguments going didn't happen. When he died, according to Jay, he said it was a tremendous vacuum. And this is late 60s. And that's when the things start changing. Jay Haley steps down. Well, you could say he stepped down, or you could say that the editorship of Family Process was wrested from him. And Don Block becomes the second director of the journal, then the only journal. There was no other journals in the field, and the shift of the journal changes. Now, if you go and look at the Family Process, from the last issue that Haley edited to the first issue that Don edited, there's a shift to family of origin oriented studies, as in contrast to here and now interaction oriented studies. It's fascinating. Out of that came some of the things that later, a decade later, late 1970s, evolves into the self-described postmodern movement, and Harry Galushan and Harlene Anderson at the Galveston Houston Institute, and Michael White in Australia, people who essentially came in and attempted to deconstruct, for lack of a better word, the earlier models.
In every field it happens like that, no? Yeah. You have a time of construction, and after deconstruction and reconstruction is a movement of life? No?
That's right, and I think we're in a reconstruction phase right now, put in that way. I hope, I see a bright future in that we are rediscovering many of the things that many said weren't true about the early years. From the very beginning. Jay Haley, he said it over and over, anytime he was working with a client, a patient, and the patient wasn't doing well, Jackson would say to him, "What did you do to make that happen?" To Jay. And Jay had to think, what did I do? I, the therapist. What is that but second order cybernetic? You know, I'm the therapist, I'm involved. It's not just that person and their drama or their dilemma in their family. It's both a first order and a second order phenomenon. And Jackson was writing about that in 1955. Sullivan called it participant observation. So Sullivan saw a psychiatrist as a participant observer, and he knew just what he meant. This wasn't something he didn't understand. That you as a therapist are a participant in what it is you're observing. That's higher order thinking. He spoke those lectures in 1939, so they are not new. And he explicitly talks about the therapist as a participant observer. He lays out basically simple cybernetic logic eloquently. He talks about the disadvantages of the language that we use. Our language is so embedded in individual linear logic. This is Harry Sullivan in 1939. And he was the teacher of all of these people, Jackson being one. He's really an underappreciated person. He died in Paris. He had a heart attack in Paris. He was 57 years old. He was over working for the World Health Organization when he died. I consider him the grandfather of it all.
Yes. You have this idea, you said everything was written in 1939, if I heard you. But when did this idea was recognized by the field of family therapy? You know, it took a lot of time.
Well, for sure, most of the first generation of psychiatrists who became family therapists, systemically oriented family therapists, were students of Sullivan. Certainly Jackson was. Don Block was. They went to school together. Block at Ackerman Institute, later at Ackerman Institute. Helm Sterling in Germany. These were all people at Chestnut Lodge in Maryland when Sullivan was alive and and they were all under his tutelage. So even though many people didn't talk about his influence, my understanding from Richard Fish, others, is that through the 50s and early 60s, everyone acknowledged Harry Sullivan. And then suddenly people stopped to, I think it's a generational thing. You know, the next generation don't emphasize that. And so then, as you said, we have to reconstruct or deconstruct, construct, deconstruct, and reconstruct.
It's been over.
Yes, over and over. So that by the late 70s, there's mavericks, in essence, coming into the field and saying we don't believe in this and we don't believe in that. And so Lynn Hoffman saying some of the things she wrote in the literature, for instance, where she distanced herself from her first, because she was at MRI for the first decade of her career. And this all begins to happen in the late 70s. Other good, I mean, not that that's a bad thing, I don't mean to draw that distinction, but about that same time, other people, Moni El-Qaim is coming into the field, and he is having his, he's part of this development of family therapy in the French language parts of the world. Carlos Slutsky comes and becomes the director for a period of time at MRI. Things evolve, and it comes to the next generation, and that's where we are now.
Yes, and what is the trend now? You know, what, do you see a common point or a common movement, or do you consider that now it's everybody can do what
It depends on who you ask, frankly. In the United States, systems, we're in a battle. Psychopharmacology is funding everything. Genetic research, there's incredibly large numbers of dollars going into the funding of genetic research, predispositions, and trying to through genotypes and DNA. It's just so there's this large, very well funded movement within the medical world to medicalize or make diagnostics for breathing even, which is really quite ironic, because at one point Jackson, one of his best papers was called Family Medicine, came out in '66, and he talks about how relevant family thinking is to, you name it, to any kind of anomaly or any kind of somatic illness. So there was a period of time, actually, we had the journal Family Systems Medicine, I don't know if it still exists, where we're appreciating the complexity of things. It seemed like a natural fit for systems, and in many circles that's true within medical. But it's this profit. Now you're getting into just my opinion. It's the power of money and profit that it tries to oversimplify very complex ideas. But anyway, that's one. And then for about a decade, at least maybe 15 years, in the United States, in the American Association for Marriage and Family Therapy accredited doctoral and master's degree programs, there's about 200 of them around the nation and in Canada. There's been this shift to postmodern thinking. And so that now it's our program. I teach in a master's and a doc program at my university. We're very rare. We're probably, I've been told, and I think it's maybe true, the purest so-called systems-oriented school, where we've intentionally kept that as what it is we're interested in teaching, the faculty at that school. You know, we get invited to all the programs and all the meetings, and we're there, but we're seen as somehow not really appreciating the new wave of postmodern. But now postmodern, it's interesting, in the United States, I'm going to get to the rest of the world in a minute, is being pushed aside because insurance companies have pushed for evidence-based practices, and it just so happens that the federally funded research indicates that these evidence-based practices essentially are hybrids of the early systems approaches. So they may not call themselves MRI brief or strategic or structural, but when you look at their practices, they're teaching exactly what we teach, and then because they're getting effective outcomes, that's what's catching on. So that's what seems to be happening, and it's essentially money-driven in the United States. Ericsson got involved with the Bateson team in the mid-'50s, and it exponentially improved the thinking in the Palo Alto group and on Ericsson's part. That was a two-way street, I think. Well, the reason I bring it up is because we were thinking the future. You know, Jeff Zeig in 1980 founded the Ericsson Foundation just before Ericsson died, and he has really done a really incredible job of keeping Ericsson's work alive, has institutes, affiliated institutes all over the world. I bring it up because China it's not even sleeping anymore. It's the giant of the world. And I know that Jeff and others within the Ericsson circles are actively involved in all kinds of projects in China. And so when you think about just numbers of people, you know, raw population with China and India, I think it's absolutely a wonderful thing to see really well-qualified people like the teachers of Ericksonian hypnotherapy making inroads into China. I personally think that Europe is the place to be, because here it seems systems is really just coming into its own everywhere. I think Eric is having a strong, Eric and Moni and in Italy, there's any number of strong family therapy centers all over Norway and Sweden, Finland. There's England. There are groups that are connected, even though they don't think they are, like solution-focused brief therapy and these other models. So actually, I personally think that Europe is where it's at and can and will lead, because systems thinking is just it is as profoundly true as ever.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. I enjoyed that. That was a great.